It's the worst. You're at a furry convention or a meetup and you see someone you haven't seen in forever. You go up to them, get their attention and say, hey, and you freeze. You stand there, looking at them up and down, trying to buy as much time as possible, but you to lost cause. All that excitement of seeing them, gone. All because you forgot their name. Forgetting someone's name. It happens all too often, not just in real life, but especially in the furry fandom. And trust me, if you have trouble remembering other furries' names, you are not alone. Names are one of the hardest things to remember about an individual, and when you add things like their persona or character names that they prefer to go by, things can get even easier to forget. And it may even seem futile to try and remember everyone's name because they can be so hard to remember, you can forget them literally seconds after someone tells you their name for the first time. But it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, I've made a concerted effort to avoid forgetting everyone who I've made a genuine connection with in this fandom, and I can confidently say that for the last year or so, I have remembered the names of everyone who I've made friends with in this fandom. And it wasn't due to being any more special or smart than anyone in this fandom. In fact, with just a few easy techniques, you too can remember the name of every single person you meet in this fandom. So let's talk about names, why they are particularly hard to remember in a fandom where they are so important, and of course, some strategies that you can use to never forget someone's name in this fandom ever again. But to understand how to remember them, we first need to understand why names are particularly hard to remember about people. It really is true, you shouldn't feel all that bad about forgetting people's names, especially in a community like the furry fandom, because in reality, the fact that you might struggle to remember names is hardly your fault at all. Names as an abstract idea have this weird dichotomy where they are used to identify individuals amongst the broader community, but hardly ever have anything to do with the individual that they are identifying. Another way to put this idea is that names are pretty arbitrary. When it comes to people, names typically have no other connection to the person that they are naming other than the person itself, which is in stark contrast to the names that we give things that are not people. I mean, think about the names of things that are just generally well known, like this. This is the Golden Gate Bridge, or this. This is the Sydney Opera House. The names that we give these things are directly tied to what they are and what they do. Like the Golden Gate Bridge is a suspension bridge that goes over the Golden Gate, a body of water between two ends of the bridge. And the Sydney Opera House is literally a house where operas are performed at in Sydney. Both of these names describe the thing that they are named after, making it easy for our minds to make the necessary connections to remember them. But when it comes to the names of people, that generally doesn't happen. The name itself doesn't describe the person who owns that name. And that's just for everyday people. When you add the creativity of the furry fandom into the mix, it could get even worse. One of the most fun parts about making a persona or character is the name that we get to choose, because when it comes to names, the options are wide open. Members of this fandom are named after nouns, verbs, adjectives, a mix of words that are real and even words that are not real. Heck, there are even a bunch of furries that are named after numbers, of which there are literally endless possibilities to choose from. Not only that, there are a decent amount of names that come up more than once in this fandom, which does happen in real life, of course, but the problem is exacerbated when combined with what we just went over. For example, I know 4 other Finns other than me, and 2 of them spell it without the extra N at the end. And without knowing us personally, there's nothing about our personas or characters that implies that, yep, that's definitely a Finn with 2 N's, alright. So again, don't feel too bad that names are hard for you, especially in the furry fandom. But just because they are hard doesn't mean they're not important, because in this fandom in particular, they definitely are. Being able to essentially rename yourself and have full control over what people call you in a specific community is very powerful, and many furries take advantage of that to experiment with their identity with their names. We've actually done a full video on this before, but in short, names give people an opportunity to experiment with things like gender, refer to something about themselves or their persona that's meaningful to them, or just be silly and cute and have that expressed in their name. The point I'm trying to get at here is that despite the difficulty of remembering them, names are very important to people in this fandom and worth the effort it takes to remember them. I mean, I like people remembering my name, and I'm sure you do too. Calling someone by their name is one of the most simple but most powerful ways you show respect towards someone. Thankfully, learning how to remember everyone's name is not nearly as complicated as it may seem, and after implementing a few simple techniques, calling people the name they wish to go by will become second nature to you in this fandom. So let's review some of the techniques that I use to remember the names of people that I meet in this fandom. Keep this in mind while we're going over this, but the core idea here is that our brain is not naturally good at remembering names, so we need to work with it, not against it, to help us recall and save specific names. And this process starts the moment you meet someone new. The first step in remembering people's names is to ask for it and repeat it immediately after. Let's say you're meeting someone with the name of Andy. First, ask for their name, then repeat it when saying it's nice to meet them, even before you respond with your own name. Hey there, what's your name? Andy? Awesome. Nice to meet you, Andy. As simple as this response might be, by repeating the name out loud to the person you just met, you are forcing your brain to process it a lot more than just hearing it for the first time. For starters, when you ask for it, the person not only tells you their name, but also tells you how to pronounce it as well, which can be important for some of the more complicated names in this fandom. Secondly, by repeating it to them after, you are allowing your brain to immediately do something with the information it just received. You first have to recall it, which is simple enough since it's still fresh, but by interacting with that name again, you are already storing it in your short-term memory for quick access. Secondly, by saying it back to them, your brain now has to translate the name that it just stored into speech, which involves recalling the motions your mouth needs to make in order to reproduce the sound of the name, sending those instructions to your mouth, and ensuring you are saying the name correctly, loud enough for them to hear it, and in a tone that reflects the excitement of meeting someone new. That's what makes our brain so fascinating. All of that processing happens in a fraction of a second, but that's still a lot of things your mind has to do with a new name, meaning it implicitly has to store it somewhere in memory to say it back to the person you just met. And it doesn't stop there. To help that name really stick, you can reinforce this in your first conversation with this person. Now, it might be a little awkward to constantly bring up the name of someone who just told it to you, but if you're strategic, you can get some practice repeating the name by forgetting how to pronounce it and wanting to ensure you get it right. But even if that doesn't happen naturally, something that I started doing that does wonders for storing that name into memory is asking for it right as I'm about to leave. Once our conversation has come to a natural close and I'm on my way out, I'll quickly say something like, "It's Andy, right?" to confirm that I have the name correct. Or if I do somehow forget it in our conversation, I'll say something like, "Well, look, I'm sorry, I gotta head out. I gotta go water my fish. It was awesome talking to you. Remind me what your name was? Andy? Great, I'll see you later, Andy." It might seem really subtle, but it's that last bit of repetition that can make or break me remembering someone's name or not. Now, the most fresh piece of information from that conversation we just had is their name, and in a lot of cases, they'll do the same to you so they don't forget your name. Remember earlier on when we mentioned that we tend to remember names that are self-descriptive? Well, we can take advantage of that mental inclination and associate something about them or the environment that they're in when learning someone's name. Our minds love making associations with different things that are meaningful to us. Maybe when you cook a family recipe, the smell reminds you of your childhood growing up. Or maybe listening to a certain song evokes the emotions of when you heard it for the first time. Mixing our environment with our memories is something that we do quite naturally, which means it's something we can tap into when it comes to remembering people's names. And the great thing about this fandom is a lot of the time you get a free start. Most furries' names are the names that they give to their persona or character, which have their own unique characteristics. But even though those specific characteristics can vary wildly, they are still something that describes who that individual is, which we tend to remember more than names. So one thing that helps me remember a name specifically is attaching the name to something about their species or the environment when trying to remember it. For example, instead of just trying to remember Andy, I can remember that this individual is Andy the Wolf and even address them as such. Or you can do it based on the environment. If you meet me at a convention, you can say that I am Finn from FWA, for example. By doing this, we are taking something that we remember easily, things that describe the person or the environment, and attaching it to the name. And you can even take this a step further and make small mnemonics to make the combination of info that you know about someone easier to recall. As for me, I love alliteration, so if I happen to meet a wolf named Wayne who's from Wyoming, I will remember that combination of information as WWW or Triple W, noting that one of the W's represents their name, Wayne. And you can spend time drawing these connections and coming up with these fun ways to remember things in our third step, practicing your recall. This one is the most straightforward. If you constantly recall the name or names of the people whom you just met after you meet them, you will work on moving those names from short to long-term memory. Now, this isn't some brand new idea. There's numerous studies that show that one of the best ways to commit something to memory is to recall it multiple times after you first learn about it. It basically builds off our first step. Then we recalled the name immediately to ensure we didn't forget it seconds later. But going over it multiple times after that first conversation was long gone will help make the name really stick with us for months at a time. And sure, it may be a little awkward walking around muttering people's names under your breath, but there is more than one way to work on your recall. What I tend to do is try to find that person I just met on social media a few hours after I meet them. That's something I know I need the name for, and if I get it right, I can see all of their posts, including their pictures, which helps me match a name to a muzzle. Another thing that I tend to do is to bring them up in conversation. Not so much to focus on them, but bring it up in really subtle ways, like describing whom I was hanging out with earlier. Like I might say something like, I met this really handsome lion named Aaron just before, and really loved the way their fursuit maker did his mane. In that sentence, the name of the person I met wasn't the focus, but it was still an excuse to say that name out loud and help commit it to memory. Though I will say this, we've been talking about this idea of moving names from your short to your long-term memory, and that's a good goal to have, but if you ask me, that may not be the best use of our brain in this particular case. Let me explain. One of the things that I've noticed about my mind is that it's a lot better at processing information than storing it. I know some people have fantastic memory and recall, but if I can spend energy working with information that is stored somewhere else instead of adding the overhead of trying to also remember it, then I will choose the former every time. So if we're not going to try and cram into memory every name of every person we meet in this fandom, but still want to remember those names, we could store them somewhere else. And for this, what you can do and what I also do is write those names down. Write them down somewhere outside of our brains for long-term storage. This is what I have started to do now that I'm meeting more people due to my content, and because I'm pretty weird, I have not just a notebook full of names, but an entire database called Furries I've Met that stores not just names, but everything that I can remember about the furries whom I've met. From the colors of their fursuit or their badge, when and where I met them, how they know me and how I know them, heck, even the topic of conversation that we first had. I put all of that away outside of my brain in a place that is easily accessible whenever I need it. And yes, again, I know, it is weird, and trust me, no personal information that they have bestowed on me is ever saved in there. But honestly, I'd rather have you all call me weird for making what is essentially a modern Rolodex for my contacts in the furry fandom, rather than embarrassing myself in front of someone I care about by forgetting their name. And it doesn't have to be nearly as complicated as this either. A journal or a notebook full of names works just as well, as long as it's something that you can review before talking to people. If you can do what I do and go over that list before any con or meetup that you attend so it's fresh in your short-term memory, then it will work just as well. But all in all, those four, repeating it right after I hear it, making external connections, practicing recall, and storing them outside of my brain, is how I've learned the skill of never forgetting anyone's name in the furry fandom. And sure, we're all people at the end of the day, and I still get names mixed up between two different people from time to time, and especially when I was just starting out on this journey, this process of reviewing and recalling wasn't second nature, so I forgot a lot of names in the process. But it is achievable and something that anyone can figure out. And in a fandom that is designed for you to meet other people and make friends, it is an invaluable skill to have. It will help you leave good impressions on those you meet, strengthen the relationships you have with members of this fandom, and most importantly, treat everyone's names with the importance that they deserve. Alright, thank you for watching. If you like videos like this, hit the subscribe button for me. It actually does a lot in telling me what kinds of videos to make for you all. But other than that, I'll catch you in the next one, and stay wild out there. Peace.